couple of weeks ago, we left our study, and we didn't have class last week, it was being Easter. A couple of weeks ago, we left our study by starting a rather quick and perfunctory review of the rest of the ministry of Jesus in Galilee. We're breaking Jesus' time on earth down basically, or his ministry down into three basic sections. One is time in Galilee. The next is his time as he travels from Galilee down to Jerusalem for the final time, and then his ministry in Jerusalem. And we haven't even started his ministry in Jerusalem yet. We have only like 4 class periods left. So we're not going to get finished. And we've spent a lot of time talking about a couple of things during this time period in his time in Galilee that both Luke and I consider to be important, but sometimes it's in the past maybe been neglected in our understanding of Jesus and his ministry. First, and I've talked with you about this more than once before, but I want to make sure you get it. I'm sure you're all intelligent people, but I just want to make sure you get it. First is the size of the crowds that gathered around him in Galilee. And as I said, we've talked about this before. Now we're talking about crowds in the hundreds. The Bible doesn't give a number, but based on what we know out of Luke and what we know out of the other Gospels, these crowds were not just 10 or 12 or 15 or maybe 20 or 25. These were crowds in the many hundreds. And by the time of the feeding of the 5,000, these crowds were larger than a lot of the towns in Kansas are. And that number 5,000 has been looked at, by the way, by many people. And is this a true number? Is this the right number? Is this the way this should be translated? Is this what it really? And yes, the writers of the Gospels were very clear that this was the number that they wanted to convey to us. And it's important for you to know and to understand this in terms of the reactions of the Jewish leaders. They were literally seeing their followers vanish. And those same people then were attaching themselves to Jesus, not by the ones or twos, not by the 5s or 10s, but by the hundreds they were doing this. Jesus was immensely more popular than the Jewish leaders. Jesus was teaching with authority. Jesus was performing signs and wonders. Jesus was providing basic necessities, feeding of the 5,000, for thousands of people. Jesus was having favor with all of them, including compassionate and decent treatment of women, of children, and the sick and the destitute. He favored all of those classes of people. And there was a time when many of his followers abandoned Jesus. I get that. John chapter 6, this is not in Luke, John chapter 6 records a time. This was following the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus talked about being the bread of life. Jesus talked to the crowd, and he admonished them for following him just in order to get more to eat. Jesus also said that he was the bread that came down from heaven, in contrast to Moses calling down the manna in the wilderness, because the people made that connection. And that made the Jews uneasy, because Jesus was telling them, in essence, that he indeed was from God. And so many abandoned him at that time. And at the end of this particular discourse, where many of his followers abandon him, this happens. And I'm going to read starting with verse 61 of John chapter 6. Aware that his disciples were grumbling about this, Jesus said to them, "Does this offend you? Then what if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? The Spirit gives life. The flesh counts for nothing. The words that I've spoken to you, they are full of the Spirit and life, and yet there are some of you who do not believe." For Jesus had known from the beginning which of them did not believe and who would betray him. And then he went on to say, "This is why I told you that no one can come to me unless the Father has enabled them." And from this time, many of his disciples turned back, no longer followed him. You do not want to leave too, do you? Jesus asked the 12, those that he had selected. And Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and know that you are the Holy One of God. Jesus, however, quickly regains more followers following this, especially following his coming back into Judea after his ministry in Galilee. In John chapter 12, John records that the Pharisees said this in Jerusalem. Now we're skipping ahead a little bit. Pharisees said this following the raising of Lazarus from the dead. This is late in his ministry. John says, the crowd that was with Jesus when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to spread the word about Jesus. Many people, because they heard that he had performed this sign, that is, raising Lazarus from the dead, many people went out to meet him. And so the Pharisees, well, they all got together over here in the corner, and the Bible didn't specifically say that. They all got together over in the corner, and they said to one another, see, this is getting us nowhere. Look how the whole world has gone after him. Okay, that's first. These huge crowds that follow Jesus around listening to him.
How did that many people hear what he was saying? Because he was Jesus?
Norma, you always have these questions, you know?
Well, I thought it a long time. I wanted to know.
I really don't know. When you think about the feeding of the 5,000, I mean, think about that. I have no idea. 5,000 people is a lot of people. You know, this new baseball stadium over here will hold 8,000. The old one held about 5,000. So think about the old Lawrence Dumont Stadium filled with people, and how number one, you could keep everybody organized. Number two, how you would make them all sit down and eat and do the things in the feeding of the 5,000. I don't know. And
We have hearing aids and we can't hear.
I get it, you know. I don't know whether he spoke and then his disciples re-spoke. I don't know whether, I don't know how he did it. It doesn't say. I guess that's my best answer. I just don't know. If anybody else has any better answers. Nobody has any better answers, Norma. Yeah, I really don't know how that worked back then. Even with several hundred people, I would think it would be difficult for everyone to be able to hear, you know, especially if you had some kind of a hearing issue of some sort. I don't know how that worked.
Maybe they didn't have hearing problems.
You know, but you even wonder about such gross things as, well, they didn't have porta potties. What did they do? You know, I mean, I don't know. They didn't have hand sanitizer. They didn't have, you know, the Bible doesn't talk about that, and I don't know that there's much actually extra biblical that's written about that kind of thing. I just really don't know.
On what's this new movie that's out that they're showing all the time? They showed the other day where they'd gathered, and they had them just divide up in groups, and the apostles would repeat what Jesus
Yeah,
said.
and that's a possibility. Acts chapter 1 and 2 kind of allude to that. If you kind of read between the lines, that it seems to be kind of happening, that different groups are being taught by different apostles and followers of Jesus, maybe out of the 120 that were in the upper room. I don't know, but there's kind of an allusion to that. Okay, we're going to go on. Norma may have another question about this second one. Second was Jesus' assertion in Nazareth that he was the fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy concerning the coming of the Messiah. We talked at considerable length about Jesus reading that prophecy in Isaiah in the synagogue and what all happened there. This was the first time that we know of that Jesus held himself out to be that Messiah that everyone Jewish was looking for at about the time prophesied by Daniel. We talked about that. Remember, it's a 70 weeks prophecy, a week in Jewish thought being a period of 7 years. Genesis chapter 29 and verse 27 is another place where the word week in Hebrew was used to denote a period of 7 years, so it's not all that unusual for Daniel to do that. And of course, this doesn't sit well with the Nazarenes. We're back up in Nazareth again. We're back up in this part of Israel. That doesn't sit well with the Nazarenes. They remember Jesus as the son of a carpenter. They know his mother, his father, his family. How can this guy of humble means be the Messiah that was spoken of by the prophets of old? And so quickly now we're going, and that was the second one. And Norma doesn't have a question about that. No. All right, we're good. So let's quickly review the rest of the Galilean ministry. We talked some about the calling of the 12. That they were all called in Galilee. Jesus may well have known at least some of these men for many years because they were all in the same general area. Jesus spent his youth and his early adulthood in Galilee, in this area, and it would just stand to reason that he would know, or they would have known of each other, at least some of them anyway. We also talked about Jesus teaching on the kingdom of God, or some kind of a similar phrase, the kingdom of heaven. Matthew and Luke use that phrase almost 100 times together in their writings. That's an important phrase, and it needs to be well understood. So we go on into some detail with the rest of these subjects that have come up in the Galilean ministry. First, the Beatitudes. Yes, Matthew records the Beatitudes, but Luke also records at least a portion of the Beatitudes that Matthew records. In the Beatitudes, Jesus says that happy are those who are the poor, the hungry, those who weep, and those who are persecuted. And then he declares that those who are rich, those who are full, those who are famous, he declares them to be unhappy or even cursed. Which doesn't make a lot of sense to us. Doesn't make a lot of sense to them either. But that's what he says. And if you got to stop and think about it. You got to stop and think about what Jesus' ministry is, you got to stop and think about what he's trying to get across, what he's trying to say. The Beatitudes in Luke, when we combine them with a more full account that's in Matthew, they offer a really rich and beautiful perspective on life and living. They're a wonderful example of the upside down workings of God. And we've talked about that in various classes as well, how God often works just the opposite of what we would expect. God often chooses the second rather than the first. God chooses the poor rather than the rich. God chooses the down and out rather than the well-to-do. God chooses David, the last of all of the brothers, instead of any of the other ones. We don't know why, but that's the normal way God works. And when you look at it that way, the Beatitudes, that's the normal way God works. As far as God's concerned, the things that the world believes to be good, God often declares just the opposite to be so. And God works this way, as we've talked, throughout Scripture, throughout the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. Paul says that God told him, "My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I, Paul, will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me." And then Paul goes on, he says, "That's why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, I delight in insults, I delight in hardships and persecutions and in difficulties." And Paul says, "For when I am weak," what's the rest of that verse? "Then I am strong." Christianity is a countercultural, upside-down movement, and it still is. Jesus also gives the golden rule warns against false teachers, describes his followers, or desires rather, his followers to build their lives on solid foundations, among other practical teaching in that part of the Gospel of Luke. Healings. This is a big deal. Jesus' healings in this section include the servant of the centurion, the raising of the son of the widow of Nain, the curing of a demon-possessed man, Jairus' daughter, the woman with a hemorrhage, the feeding of the 5,000. Why is that in with the healings? I'm not sure. The healing, I put it in the wrong spot, the healing of a boy with a demon, and there are many others that are not named as well. It says, the Gospel, Luke just says that he healed many, and with various diseases and ailments and illnesses. We don't know how many, but there are some that are specifically mentioned. Okay, let's talk for just a minute about these people Jesus healed. We'll throw out the feeding of the 5,000. I got that in the wrong place. Notice that both Jews and Gentiles were healed by Jesus. Notice that the sworn enemy of the Jews, Roman soldiers, sometimes received Jesus' favor. The healing of the servant of the centurion. Notice that women were held in honor by Jesus and his regard for their health. Notice that Jesus touched and healed those considered to be ceremonially unclean. Physically touched them. And notice that Jesus healed children. He didn't just heal prominent Jewish leaders. In fact, I don't know that he ever did. But women, children, Gentiles, those possessed, yeah. Those that were unclean, yeah, he touched them. Countercultural, upside down. Those were classes of people, Gentiles, women, the unclean children. They were often ignored. They were often pushed aside. They were often treated badly by the Jews. Jesus is not swayed by the popular Jewish culture here. He loves and serves them all. You know, it seems to me there's an example in there somewhere, maybe for us. Maybe we might want to emulate that as we work with and deal with and interact with the world outside of the kingdom. I don't know about you, but it can sometimes be a little uncomfortable for me to work with those, I'll say, outside. It can be a little uncomfortable. It's becoming a little more comfortable for me, having been here for several years and having people at the door wanting or needing whatever it is they want or they need. Anything from Fix-A-Dent for their false teeth to a place to live. Or, and I've said this before, to a roll of paper towels. One guy wanted a roll of paper towels, and you may have heard me tell this story before. But he was a homeless guy. He had stuff. He had a job of cleaning a business's windows, and he was out of paper towels. He had Windex, but he didn't have paper towels. And he wanted to know if we'd give him a roll of paper towels so he could do this job, so he could be paid, I don't know, $10, whatever it was. So we gave him a roll of paper towels. Sometimes interesting things happen during the week. And sometimes interesting people come to the door.
Oh, yeah, or they come for free food.
They get that out of the blessing box. Mm-hmm. Parables. Parables. Jesus' parables include the blind leading the blind, the pupil not being above his teacher, the speck in the brother's eye and the log in your own eye. The good tree doesn't produce bad fruit, and the bad tree doesn't produce good fruit. Building a house on the rock instead of on the sand. two debtors, one who owed a lot, one who owed a little. The parable of the sower. John, are you writing all this down? The parable of the sower. Am I going too fast? And the parable of the lamp. And you may have remembered those. He did miracles as well, calming the sea, feeding the 5,000, the transfiguration. All of this happened during his time in Galilee. I want to stop here for just a minute. I have a minute. And I want to dwell a bit on a passage in the first few verses of chapter 8 in Luke. Luke tells us about women who were followers of Jesus and were helping support him and the disciples. Luke says that Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Susanna, along with, Luke says, many others who were with Jesus and the disciples. Soon afterwards, Jesus began going around from one city and village to another, proclaiming and preaching the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, and also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and sicknesses, Mary, who was called Magdalene, from whom several demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward, and Susanna, and many others who were contributing to their support out of their private means. This is while he was in Galilee yet. Does that seem odd to you? Does that seem odd to you? We talk about these followers, these people out in the open air, out in the roads or wherever, just, camping out for the night, I presume, going day to day, day by day, whatever, following Jesus, listening to him, helping him perhaps with teaching part of the big crowds. That women would travel with Jesus and the 12 in that culture?
I would say it was highly unusual because women, it's crazy, but that's the way it was. They were looked as subordinates.
They had a bad name.
Shadow, is that chattel? Shadow, the word, whatever.
Chattel.
Yeah, not cattle, but shadow. And so you got these ladies, now there probably been some men that were supporting too, but I think it's very interesting because.
More than one. I mean, Mary Magdalene, you can kind of see if she was healed from the spirits and so on, she might want to tag along, but these others, Joanna, was she a Jew? I don't know. She was the wife of Herod's steward, but Herod was a Jew, but only a name only. He wouldn't have bothered him to have had Gentiles serving him. I don't know. What would the rumors be? Stop and think about that. What would the rumors be like today? What would the rumors be like today if Curtis Baker developed a following and just started wandering around the city and had a bunch of women following him around, camping out at night and whatever, along with a bunch of men? What would the rumors be like? Here's an itinerant preacher. Here's 12 at least other men, some of whom were married, several women, some of whom were married, some not, traveling together day after day, living together day after day. It just seems weird.
Could it not be that the women went along to do the cooking because men didn't cook, did they?
Who was at
See,
the
that's what I
cross?
was thinking.
Yeah.
The cooking and the sewing.
Yeah.
Who was at the cross, Jay? Who was at the resurrection?
Who was the first to tell the disciples of the resurrection? And who was at the resurrection? Yeah, I agree, Bill. I agree. Women in Jesus' ministry and life were given very prominent roles, even I think by today's standards. And especially, not only what Bill said, but this as well. And you can, if you watch The Chosen, I mean, you'll see that there'll be women there along with Jesus and the crowds and so on. I don't know. I mean, the Bible doesn't explain it. I see you, Eileen. The Bible doesn't explain it, but it's just, you just kind of wonder.
There probably wasn't as much gossip going on back in that day.
Wasn't as much what?
Gossip.
It's an American way of life.
There's more gossip today than there was then.
Yes.
I don't know about
But they were following Jesus. And they had a mindset of Jesus' teachings.
There was, it was different than, how would I say this? It was different than somebody following some guru in the 1960s.
Yes.
It was different than the Flower Children and all of that, if you're old enough to remember that kind of thing. It was different.
And it was a group of women, not just one or two.
Yeah, and it was a group of women, and I don't know, maybe they did cook, I don't know what they did.
Says they supported them out of their own means. That's what the Bible says.
Yeah, some of these women, we missed that. Hang on just a second, Jerry. Some of these women were not poor and destitute by any means. And some of them, it does say by their own means, they might have been chattel in some areas, but these women, if they had their own bank accounts, so to speak, and they had their own wealth. Yeah.
I'm always looking for human connection and influence, and the one that jumps out at me is the manager of Herod's household.
Right,
How did Herod treat Christ when all this
Right.
was going on?
right. This was the wife of the manager of his household.
Thank
Yes.
you, that's the same question I had too.
Yeah, and it doesn't say.
No. 'Cause
It
I was
doesn't
looking
say.
at it and don't think that,
But I think that's good in knowing that Jesus had, how would I say this, a wide variety of followers. I mean, he had Jewish people, he had Gentiles, he had children, he had women of means, he had whoever this wife of Herod's, household manager was.
He was a wage earner.
And others that, I mean, this was, this kind of, I just had this epiphany. This kind of reminds me of what the kingdom is supposed to look like today.
Yes,
Make sense?
yeah.
Yes.
Terry, you look like you want to say something.
Thankfully.
I can always tell when you want to say something.
Thankfully, that the good Lord created women with intrinsic thoughts that we men can't even pick up on. I mean, they have such a way. My observation through the decades has seen how women are such a strong part of the church. I mean, my goodness, you see they bring the little ones. Maybe their husband is still out carousing, being an absolute fool. We men are fools, and maybe not everybody agrees, but so you see these women, and they're such a stalwart part of the church.
In other words, they went along to make sure the men didn't get in trouble.
We men are in trouble all the time because we're dumb. All right, really. I mean, we create wars, we slaughter, we kill, but that's the way it is. So.
Well, don't look over there, Terry.
Thankfully, and so these women are mentioned here because that's important. They're nurturing.
And another big thing is, I'm sure, they felt safe there somehow or another. There would be some there would be some areas where it would not feel that, where with a bunch of men we don't know, or with a bunch of people here we don't know. They had to have felt a good measure of safety there, even in the middle of the night, whatever, and however it is they camped out or whatever it was they did. There was some kind of a measure, I think, of safety there, and dare I use the word security, that may not have been present in a lot of that area during that day, during that time, and it's just, I mean, it just struck me as being kind of an unusual thing, But as I think about it, yeah, that's what the kingdom needs to look like today. And I'll just carry that a little bit further. In the kingdom today, people need to feel a sense of safety. Not only feel a sense of safety, but actually experience it. People need to feel safe in the things they say and the things that they do, and not having the gossips, and not, that kind of thing, and experiencing the love and experiencing the compassion and so on. Yeah, there's a lesson here for us today.